Hello, and welcome to this week's online learning module. As we discussed in class, I will not be there the week of the 16th. However, you are to do the activities in this week's learning module. I hope that you started with the README file because that outlines all the steps in order that you need to complete. Your completion of this module will result in the same amount of points earned as if you had attended class for the week. So I hope that you take the time to do that. Today we're going to be talking about using specific feedback and praise to motivate students in your class. We're going to be discussing what's appropriate to say to students in terms of feedback and what's maybe less effective to say. First of all, what is feedback? Feedback is the transfer of information from the teacher to student based on assessment. So this could be formative assessment, informal, not graded. This could be summative, things that you give at the test, for example, that you give at the end of a unit and graded. Any type of time, even any observations that you observe in classroom, that's in a kind of assessment. And when you say something to students to help them improve, that's feedback. When you're giving effective feedback, you should consider several things. First of all, the amount. Many teachers give way too much feedback when they're giving feedback. So, for example, when I'm grading your writing, I'm not going to correct all your grammar and correct all your spelling and all of your APA mistakes, and that would just be depressing. Probably, I know that would be depressing for me if somebody did that. But I might pick out 3 or 4 things about your paper and say, I want you to focus on improving this, and give you that feedback, and then look for change over time. The timing should be as soon as possible. If you give an assignment and it's graded and you hand it back a month later, the feedback's probably not going to be very effective. Generally, we like to see feedback given within a week. In college classes, I think the standard is no more than 2 weeks. The mode, you can give feedback or praise orally. You can give it in written form on, for example, a homework or a test. You can even give a demonstration for feedback, depending on the context. Audience, you should use developmentally appropriate language. So you wouldn't use the same words, for example, with a kindergartner that you would with a 12th grader. I've seen feedback given in the form of smiley faces to first graders who aren't able to read yet, and that's completely appropriate. The type of task affects the amount of feedback you give. For example, if you're giving multiple choice tests, you're probably not going to give a lot of feedback. What you might do is, if you notice that most of your class missed a particular multiple choice item, you might review that together in class and say, here's why A wasn't a good option, here's why B is the best option. A project, for example, or a paper, you're probably going to give a little more feedback on. And finally, another thing to consider is the learner's ability. You need to give them feedback relative to their ability. So instead of thinking of everyone having to hit the same mark, think about some students being at different points along the learning continuum. A famous Russian psychologist by the name of Lev Vygotsky, you might have heard of him, visualized learning as a continuum, and people are at different points on their continuum. And so your job is to get them from one point to the next point. Learning occurs in something we call a zone of proximal development. And so you can't get students to jump over three points, or if you think about it as a ladder, up 3 rungs of a ladder, but you can get them to go to the next rung on the ladder. Effective feedback is goal-directed, so you're going to be focusing on having the learner visualize a goal in his or her mind and trying to get him or her to move towards that goal, not comparing themselves to other. Scaffolded, in other words, it's sort of like what I was saying on the previous slide. You're trying to scaffold them or support them and get them to the next rung on the ladder, to get them to the next point on the learning continuum. And there are a lot of different ways to do this, to provide scaffolding. So, for example, you can show them the next little step. That's considered scaffolding. I touched on self-referenced rather than having learners compare themselves to others in the class. You did the best job in the class, Sally. You would have them compare themselves with their own previous work and note progress or improvement. And finally, standards reference. What this means is you want to get students to focus on how much progress they're making towards achieving standards or learning objectives. There's been a lot of research on this concept of mastery learning versus performance learning, starting back in the 60s and 70s with Benjamin Bloom, and then more lately Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck especially sees two types of learners. Mastery learners compare their work to some standard of mastery and see their own progress towards mastery, and so are less likely to become discouraged if they hit a glitch. So in terms of mathematics, for example, if I'm saying, oh, I've got to learn to master two-digit multiplication problems, and my teacher is constantly focused on that standard objective, I'm much more likely to be able to survive little setbacks. Okay, well, I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm going to. Whereas performance learners compare their work to others' performers or to some artificial standards such as grade. And teachers sometimes reinforce this by encouraging them to see their status in black and white. Bobby's good at math, Sally's bad at math. And they're much more likely to become discouraged if they hit a glitch. So, for example, if I am doing a math test and maybe I studied more, maybe I'm just better at a particular topic, and I get 100 on the test, and the teacher hands it back to me and says, good job, I can tell you're a good student in math. Then the next time when I don't do as well, maybe I haven't studied as hard, or maybe it's a little more difficult for me, that particular topic, and I get a 60, and the teacher hands it back and maybe says, what happened? I might start to internalize, I'm not good. I'm a performance learner. I'm not good at math. And so I'm much more likely to become discouraged. Whereas if the teacher had handed that test back and said, the first time, I can see you really mastered two-digit multiplication, and now you might want to think about this, I'm much more likely to focus on the standards and the mastery of the standards than I am on my own performance compared to a grade, for example. We want to encourage an attitude towards mastery learning in our classroom, and we can do this by using effective feedback and praise. So let's look at some of the general characteristics of effective feedback or praise. We never want to use general feedback. We don't want to say something like, good job, because that doesn't tell the student anything. And we say it a lot. I know we all say it. But instead, you want to be specific about what you're praising the student about or providing feedback. So you did a good job conjugating verbs on that assignment. So the student knows specifically what you're referring to. You also want to avoid what we call internal attribute-based praise or feedback versus standards-based. It's like I was saying before. It's not good to say you are so good at math, because that encourages performance learning. Whereas I can tell you have learned how to do two-digit division is standards-based. You could tie that to a standard, mastering two-digit division. So specific and standards-based. This slide talks about self-comparison versus comparison to others. So I know students compare grades all the time, but as teachers, we don't want to encourage that behavior. So instead of saying, Sally understands better than anyone how to do this science experiment, you say, Sally, you've learned over the last month how to write hypotheses. So that's a self-comparison, and Sally will learn to be a mastery learner better that way. It's also a good idea to include, if possible, ways to improve the performance. And you can do this with even very young children. For example, if you are teaching pre-kindergarten and you're trying to teach one-to-one correspondence and counting blocks. Instead of just saying, nice job of counting those blocks, which is specific, so it's not terrible, you could say, nice job of counting those blocks. Now let's try touching them one at a time as we say the numbers. And so we've given the student not only feedback about their performance, but you've also suggested a way to improve the performance. Let's practice analyzing some feedback and praise and trying to determine if it's effective or ineffective based on the characteristics we just spoke about. So let's look at the first one. Lynette, that was a great job you did yesterday. Would you classify that as effective or ineffective praise, and then think about why? We might classify this as ineffective praise because it's not specific. We don't know what Lynette did that, and neither does Lynette, that she doesn't know what she did that what was good, and it's not related to any standards. What about the second one? Jeff, your writing is improving. Your B's are much better because you're making a straighter line and not a loop. Is this effective or ineffective praise, and why? We might classify this statement as effective praise. It is specific. It says what the student did well. It's descriptive. However, it might be better to include an area to improve as well. The last one on this slide, Miguel, you did the best in the class. Would you classify this as effective or ineffective? We might classify it as ineffective. Again, it's not specific, it's too general, and it compares Miguel's performance only to other people, not to his past performance. Let's try some more. John, I can see by your work that you're really good in math. Is this effective or ineffective praise? We might classify this as ineffective. It's too general, and it attributes success to ability, to that internal ability. That's not something a student can really control, so that encourages a poor outlook if things get rough. I'm not good at math anymore. Finally, good work. This time you doubled the length and width before adding them to find the perimeter of the rectangle. Is that effective or ineffective? We might classify this as effective. It's specific, descriptive, and it shows progress. So keep these traits of good praise or feedback in mind, especially as you're doing the posting for this week's discussion post. I'd like to change here for a minute and talk about your theory to practice observation, which is your second field work that you're doing for this class. It's due December 14th. We're skipping the draft this time. The syllabus talks about a draft that we're going to submit, but I think we'll skip that and go right to the final. It's worth a quarter of your course grade. I should say, as to the previous point, of course you can always email me your draft, and I'll be happy to give feedback, but it's not going to be compulsory at this time. So the purpose of the assignment is to relate the things that we've been learning in classroom to what you see in class to what you see going on in a K-12 classroom. So you're going to go into a classroom for 1 hour, 60 minutes, and it should be during a time when you see actual instruction going on, not just when students are quietly taking a test. So you're going to observe the teacher and the children in the classroom, but do not interact with them. Just sit there as if you're a fly on the wall and take notes. These are called field notes. So you're going to jot down when you arrived, who the teacher is, how many students are in the class, how many boys, how many girls. So what I advise is get there a few minutes early and jot down the background kinds of notes. You're going to note when the observation started and when it ended, because all of these you can put in your report. Then you're going to jot down all the things that you see going on. And so it's important not just to examine the teacher and what he or she is saying to the class, but also how the students are reacting. So some things you could look for: do you see evidence of student engagement? Do you see some students who are disengaged? Are there instances of student misbehavior? Are there interruptions in the classroom routine? Is the teacher able to follow through with his or her lesson plan? You need to think about whether this is direct instruction or constructivist learning, or a combination. You also need to think about how the teacher is assessing student learning. Is she asking questions? What kinds of questions is she asking? Is he using talk moves, for example, or if they're doing a student discussion? Think about how the lesson you're seeing relates to the concepts of Piaget, Vygotsky, Erikson, Kohlberg, and some of the other social theorists that we've been learning in class. Think about the things you're learning this week about motivation and praise and feedback, and is the teacher being effective in the use of this? So what you might do is have two columns. This is often what I recommend to students. In the left column, you could jot down the things that you see occurring: student misbehavior, teacher questions. In the right, you might jot down some observations to think about later. Piaget, question mark, or Vygotsky, or, student-led lesson, talk move evident, or something like that. So this will help you write your paper, because you're going to have to relate what you're seeing to what we've talked about in class. After you get back, it's a good idea to either type your notes or do the paper fairly quickly while it's still fresh in your mind. So don't wait 2 or 3 weeks. Try to consolidate your notes and write the paper within a week or two. Probably going to be a 4 to 6 page paper, but that's a guideline. It can go over, it can go a little under. Of course, double space and follow APA. And there are several sections that I would like to see. First of all, a context. This means, and it's worth 20% of your grade, the date and time and setting for the observation, and a description of the teacher and students in the classrooms. So you might write, for example, how many students there are, the school, and use a pseudonym for the teacher, so Mrs. H, for example. You might put in the observation started at 10:30 and ended at 11:30, for example. Activities that you saw occurring, 25%. So these are the learning activities you observed taking place. So you might write a general description of the lesson. What was the teacher trying to convey? What kinds of group work was going on? What kinds of questions were asked? What kinds of hands-on activities or other types of activities? Was it a direct instruction lesson? So this is just a general description of what you saw occurring in class. Also in this section, you might include that you noticed student disengagement or student engagement, times that the teacher had to stop and discipline a student, for example, might go in there. 25% is your connection to theory. So this is a very important discussion. It's not just what you saw, it's important to relate what you saw to what we've been learning in class. So consider Piaget, Vygotsky, Erikson, direct instruction, constructive learning, differentiation, theories of motivation, and I haven't even listed everyone or everything. So generally, just go back through the class and think about how you can relate what you saw. Was the teacher using scaffolded learning, that, for example, that Vygotsky recommended? Was the teacher using direct instruction? Feedback, what kind of feedback did the teacher give? Etc. 20% is your reflection, and sometimes students have a wonderful paper and then they forget to include this piece, and it really brings the grade down. And it's basically just a description of what did you learn in this assignment. So you might think about what you learned in terms of what you saw, in terms of teaching. Did you pick up a new way to do an activity or a new way to lead a discussion? And also what you learned in terms of how teachers apply the very important theories and ideas that we've been using in classroom. Did anything surprise you? What would you do differently if you did it again? And finally, 10% will be what we call the writing conventions, which are of course adherence to good rules of spelling, grammar, and APA. And if this is not a particularly strong area for you, you might want to let someone read your paper and edit your paper before you turn it in. Upload the final play paper, please, to Blackboard in the assignments folder by December 14th. Also, you're going to go into TaskStream and complete the TaskStream fieldwork form for this class. And the instructions for that are on the home page of the course. Any questions, please feel free to email me. And as I said before, feel free to send me a draft and I'll give you some general feedback if you'd like to do that. All right, so this completes the lecture, and so I hope you continue working through the module, and I'll see everybody on November 30th.